Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maurice Matisse, and I welcome you to today's conversation on online learning. I have up there some of the Twitter handles, so hopefully some of you will use your devices to share some thoughts on the Twitter accounts, and we'll be looking at some of those during the course of the session and maybe take some of those for some of the questions. This is the fifth session that we've had on the conversations of online learning, and I just want to remind everyone why we're doing some of these conversations and why we're looking at online learning. This is some of the issues that I think Columbia is trying to address and faces. I won't go into each of these, but obviously these are very important issues for any academic institution. If you guys want, their seats up in the front on this. These issues raise a number of very difficult questions for an institution like Columbia. And these are those issues that are going to take a lot of effort, a lot of discussion. And one of the reasons why we wanted to have a number of experts join us and tell us about their experiences at other universities and some from within the university. I also want to take a moment to share with everyone that we are about to release a couple of a few new Coursera MOOCs in January. These are the set of 3 that are going up in early January. We have a second course around virology by Professor Vincent Racaniello. We're about to release a MOOC by Jeffrey Sachs, and that will be a fairly long MOOC. I believe it's 13 weeks, 14 weeks. Has about 70 videos, so it'll be pretty popular. And we're looking forward to seeing how that goes. And we're also going to be running out of the School of Engineering a second run of the financial engineering and risk management. And so hopefully some of you will attend these MOOCs, again, to see what Columbia is doing in its in some of the Coursera courses. We are going to continue the series in the spring. This fall, Chris Dede will be the last one in 2013, but we already have a couple of speakers ready for the spring, including Alf Hilreis on January 31st. Again, we'll have that here. And we're almost close on closing the dates with Anand Agarwal from MIT and edX, and Marcia Lin from Berkeley, who is a psychologist, I believe, who does learning sciences, and someone that we are hoping to have in late March, looks like the time, and Siva Bayahayanathan, who is out of University of Virginia. So these are some of the folks we have coming for next semester. For any of you who missed the first 4, they're all available on our YouTube channel. The bit.ly link there is an easy way to get access to all of them, and I encourage anybody who wants to go back and look at Daphne Kohler's or Jeff Salingo's or Candace Steele's and Audrey Waters' sessions. They were all great, that you can go back and take a look at them. Let me proceed to introducing Chris Dede, who's here from Harvard. Not without a lot of trouble getting down from Boston to here, but he made it. We were very worried how we were going to deal with that. But he will be, his background is obviously in education, and his fields of scholarship include emerging technologies, policy, and leadership. He was given the Harvard Award for Outstanding Teacher in 2007. He is a fellow of the American Educational Research Association, a 2001 fellow. And his latest co-edited book is Digital Teaching Platforms, and it's out of Teachers College Press in 2012. Today, he is going to talk about the future of digital learning in higher education, and I welcome Professor Chris Dede to the podium.
Thanks. Well, I did have some adventures today. My Acela train broke down so thoroughly coming down from Boston that they could not move it. So they pulled up another train alongside, set up a little bridge between the two, and we all crossed over the bridge. and then proceeded from there. So it's been an exciting day so far, and I'm really happy to be here and to have the chance to share ideas with you. So last January, I co-convened a National Science Foundation funded workshop on new technology-based models of post-secondary learning. And Eric Grimson, who's the chancellor at MIT, was the other co-convener. And we invited 12 or 13 people who we thought would be good to just lock in a room and see what we could come up with in terms of what all this meant. And I'm going to share ideas out of that report today, in part in hopes of luring you into reading it. But I'll put my own particular spin on it. So if I say anything particularly wise, it was the work of the group. And if I say anything that sounds stupid, it belongs solely to me. But I don't want to start with technology, because when you start with technology, you have a solution looking for a problem, which is never a good thing. So I instead want to start with a different report that came out of the National Research Council a year ago last summer, called Education for Life and Work. And it deals with the issue of what students need to be prepared for the 21st century for a global, knowledge-based, innovation-centered civilization, as opposed to when I grew up, for a national industrial economy. And I highly recommend the report. It has a lot of very good things in it. And they break the kinds of knowledge and skills that students need into three categories: cognitive skills, intrapersonal skills, and interpersonal skills. And one reason for doing that is that there is a lot of research now that shows 10 years after you graduate, your intrapersonal and interpersonal characteristics have more to do with whether or not you succeed than your cognitive characteristics. They're all important, but the non-cognitive turn out to be very important, and we all understand that. I remember asking my dean if it was possible to put the words low maintenance into a faculty job description, and unfortunately it turns out that that's not possible to do, but we all know how difficult it can be to accomplish things with somebody that's lacking some of the key intrapersonal and interpersonal skills. And I grabbed some of the material out of that report, put it into columns. Don't read by rows, just read by columns. And what's striking, of course, when you look at this, is how much effort we put into the left-hand column, and often how very little students get, at least at many places, in the other two columns. And when you look at assessment, the situation is even more stark, because we very seldom measure anything in the other two columns, and of course what you measure is typically what gets taught. So we do face some big challenges in terms of preparing people for the 21st century. Now, at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, we have a nice model that I think does a good job of, in fact, doing this. Going across those three columns, it's a model that you probably use similar at Columbia. A lot of top-flight universities that cost a lot of money do this. You've got classroom situations that may have lecture as part of them, but they're certainly not exclusively lecture. There's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of rich interaction. There's a lot of bringing in multiple perspectives and drawing those out. We admit students who form a kind of ecology within our cohort, a diverse ecology, so that they can learn a lot from one another because they're not all similar. And then beyond classrooms, we give them situated learning experiences where they'll go out into the world, which of course is quite different than a classroom, and they will learn through internships or residencies or different kinds of field experiences, or they become part of a research team in my courses, and they learn a whole bunch of stuff that we can't possibly convey in this sort of setting. And then we have a very rich community, and in my courses, since I teach technology, it's a blended learning community where it's part face-to-face and part online, and people interact very heavily with each other. And I learn from them and they learn from me, and I try to stay half a step ahead of my very smart students. And I think at the end of the day, they do gain a lot on all three of those dimensions. However, that model is completely unscalable. It's largely becoming unaffordable. And the number of people who can have access to it is very small. So while it's a wonderful thing for people who can pay for it, it is not how we're going to accomplish education at scale in the 21st century, at least not as it's practiced right now with face-to-face learning. Now, I want to contrast that model to where I taught before I came to Harvard, which was George Mason University outside of Washington, D.C. I actually like George Mason in many ways better than I like Harvard. I thought it had a much better culture, and I liked the climate better. I offered to open up Harvard South, but unfortunately they weren't very interested in my doing that, so I had to come up to Boston. And at George Mason, though, there was a big problem in terms of this sort of model for what we should be doing with students, because 97% of our students were part-time. They were older adults. They had full-time jobs. They had families. And so they'd get up very early in the morning, they'd get the kids ready, they'd get them off, they'd go to their full-time job, they'd fight their way out to the George Mason campus, try to find a parking spot, come in and take their 4:30 to 7:10 course, and then show up at their 7:20 to 10 course, following which they would try to find their car, go home, get some rest, and prepare for another day. And so when we taught our 7:20 courses, we were facing people who were dead when they walked into the room. And somehow we had to try to make sense of it. There wasn't an opportunity for situated learning because the rest of their lives were full. There wasn't any opportunity for community because they were trying to come just once a week because it was such a hassle to get there and spend the brief few hours that they had there, that there wasn't really any opportunity for community. And of course, that's a much more typical description of what higher education is like. And I'm not being critical of George Mason. I'm simply describing what the predominant model is. Now notice I haven't talked about technology at all so far, other than saying that our report is about technology, but now we have a problem. And so now it's appropriate to ask, are there some ways that technology can give us leverage on this problem? And in particular, can we imagine doing those things that I described as the really powerful face-to-face model, the classroom, the situated learning, and the community, and somehow doing those in an online way or a blended way that would be scalable, that would be affordable, and that would have very widespread access? That's a very interesting design question. And that really was the central question for this NSF workshop, where people came together to say, we're not impressed by MOOCs. In fact, we're pretty underwhelmed by MOOCs. But if we take what we know really works well in terms of online learning, could we imagine designing something that would address this really big issue for the 21st century? Because we know that it's powerful, the potential for powerful communities is there because you can have an even more diverse set of learners. You can have an even richer ecology of learners online than you can in any physical location where you have to get people co-located, whereas online, if it's massive in particular, you can have people from all over the world. And because it's convenient, some of those people can be very busy people who we would never be able to lure into a classroom for a learning experience. And if you happen to be co-located with them in this massive virtual learning environment, maybe you would become their friend or their colleague, or they would be impressed by you in some way, and your social capital would go up so that you would be able, even after the learning experience was over, to have this very valuable connection. I mean, one of the reasons people come to Harvard, frankly, has nothing to do with the faculty. It has to do with who your roommate might be, right? At the undergraduate level, out in the yard, who am I going to get to meet? How am I going to build up my social capital? And the people at the workshop were also excited about online, as I am, because it's self-archiving. It's very difficult to sort out face-to-face experiences and figure out how to improve them. For one thing, you have to capture everything that's going on, which isn't very easy, and find some way to process it in an automated way. And for another thing, it's very difficult to conduct what we call A/B experiments, where half the time you do something one way and half the time you do it another way, and over time you sort out which is better, and you can drive cycles of rapid continuous improvement. So there's a lot of strengths to online learning. It's different than face-to-face, but there's a reason why research keeps showing us that blended is superior to online only. Having some face-to-face and online combined is superior to online only, which doesn't surprise anybody. But blended is also superior to face-to-face only, and that's where a lot of my colleagues make faces and get up and leave the room, because they don't believe that it's possible for blended to be better than face-to-face, and yet there are very compelling reasons and a lot of research that shows that that's true. So this is the group of people that we got together for a couple days and did some very intense dialogue, and every one of them was there because they didn't like MOOCs. They didn't like MOOCs, but they did like the concept of really powerful models of online and blended learning that could help us tackle this big challenge in terms of the 21st century. So why are people attracted to massive? Well, they're attracted to massive because you could really increase access in a very significant way, and because you could compose who you're learning with in some interesting ways. So if we've got 10,000 people in some kind of a learning experience, and I have the opportunity to give everybody a 15-minute survey that you have to take in order to get into the learning experience, and then I have some kind of pattern matching program that's going to find for you the best 14 people out of that 10,000 for you to be in a small learning group with, because they're just similar enough to you that you have a lot in common, but they're just different enough from you that you have a lot to learn from them. That's really potentially pretty powerful. And of course, there are people working on trying to understand how you would do that kind of matching, and how the rubrics that you used would vary depending on the kinds of instructional goals that you had. But we also know that so far, massive learning experiences, MOOCs in particular, have been markedly unsuccessful, despite all the claims of some of the people who I see also featured as speakers, so you can decide whether to believe them or me in terms of what I'm saying. But if it's massive and it's cheap, you can't have a lot of instructional presence. Those two do not go together. And you can say, well, the technology is going to be magic, and the technology is going to adapt everything. But that only works for a very limited range of subject matter where there's a small set of right answers, and the technology can figure out the path that you're taking and whether it's likely to be productive or not. It's not surprising that these MOOCs have largely centered on the kinds of subjects that lend themselves to this sort of technology-based tutoring system model, and things that are very important for the 21st century, but that aren't reducible to algorithmic recipes. Not so much that you're going to be able to apply adaptive materials as a way of compensating for reduced instructional presence. Plus, even for the subjects where you can compensate for the lack of an instructor by having some kind of very clever technology-based tutoring, the fact of the matter is that most people are highly social, and we see enormous rates of people dropping out of these massive experiences, in part because they're just not getting enough social reinforcement to hang in there. So you've got to have social reinforcement for retention. And if you don't have the expert instructor, you want to have peers, so that instead of somebody knowing the whole elephant and explaining it to you, you've got that learning group, and one person knows the trunk, and one person knows the leg, and one person knows the tail, and you put the elephant together, which actually can be sometimes a more effective way of learning than somebody just putting up the elephant and explaining it. But if we're going to go back to that model that I started with, the model of the powerful classroom and the powerful community, there's also the situated learning part, going out into the world, learning things you can't learn in the classroom and in the community. So what are we going to do about that? And the report wrestled with all of those things. It did not come up with answers, but it came up with the right dark alleys to look in, instead of under the street light of massive lectures and massive streaming videos, where MOOCs are now, which is not going to lead anywhere that we really want to be. So in the remainder of my talk, I want to highlight 3 kinds of dimensions that I think speak to this issue of powerful group dialogues and classroom settings, powerful situated learning, and ways to compensate for reduced instructional presence, even if you're not dealing with algorithmic subject matter. So one of the big things that has changed online learning and distance learning dramatically, and has also affected our informal learning dramatically, is social media. And although these are often used in relatively trivial ways, social media are, in fact, very powerful ways of sharing, thinking together, and co-creating things. And so a lot of us on faculties end up, when we're dealing with a new set of instructional goals, asking ourselves, is there a way that social media can help? And if we had more time, I would talk about the fact that I use academic social tagging, I hold Twitter chats, I have a back channel that I use in my classroom to widen the bandwidth of having a big group and very limited airtime. And I use a variety of other technologies to try to accomplish this goal. But we're not talking about my classroom, we're talking about some kind of massive online experience. And what might social media look like in terms of that? Well, I want to remind you about a recent news story that I think illustrates very well how social media can be used to aid in generating knowledge and solving a particular kind of complex situation. So I'm going to bring up a video clip, I hope, that will remind you of that news story and what this looked like. And thanks to the Acela, I did not have time to do tech checks, so we're all going to see what happens next.
Little pig, let us in! It's a police! Move!
The third little pig is now being taken into custody, so the spotlight is once again shone on the grey area of homeowners' rights to protect their properties.
This isn't right. The 3 little pigs are the victims.
Threw down 2 houses. You got what you deserve.
But the pigs went too far.
You have every right to defend your property.
Kick your chinny chin chins up, fellas.
Boiling someone alive hardly constitutes reasonable
Somebody is going to break the law and intrude on you.
You can't protect yourself in your own home.
A man's home is his castle. You've got a family to deal with.
If someone tried to blow my house down, I'd do the same.
I knew the wolf. There's no way he could have blown down those houses. He had asthma.
But the wolf had asthma. So what's the truth about the pigs' houses being blown down? Inside job.
There's no reason why those 2 houses, one made from straw, the other from wood, should have collapsed. Not even a healthy wolf's huff and puff could bring them down.
The 3 little pigs have confessed to conspiring to commit insurance fraud, framing the wolf in an attempt to cover their tracks. Their motive was financial, as they struggle to keep up with their mortgage repayments.
Guilty. I can empathise with the pigs.
I'm behind on my payments too.
How could this have happened?
I've lost everything.
Well, maybe this wasn't a recent news story, but it is a familiar story. And what's interesting, of course, is that The Guardian, which is truly one of the great newspapers in the world, created this kind of an advertisement. Now, it's not hard to understand why, because the model for print journalism has collapsed, the financial model. And so they're trying to reinvent themselves, even the best of the best, to survive in a digital world. And what they're portraying in this, beneath all the fun, is a very clever combination of top-down expertise and bottom-up social media, perspective-taking, ethical stances, personal stories and case histories, and so on. So as we learn the rhetoric of how to use social media effectively in collective knowledge construction, we're going to be finding models like this that I think can really be very helpful for us in understanding what's going on. So part of how we would get that community that we have face-to-face in this elite model of higher education, would be to be clever about how we use social media. Now, could we do that in a massive way? Well, yes, because of mobile devices. Some of you may remember the first powerful handheld device for learning, the Little Professor calculator from 1976, 37 years ago. One of the great tragedies of my life is I now look like the Little Professor. I really never thought I would get this old. And of course, our modern devices are much more powerful on a whole set of dimensions than was that 37 years ago. My colleagues tell me that within the next decade, we will gain as much power again on all those dimensions as we did in the last 37 years. So you have to imagine everyone, even people in remote villages and developing countries or kids in poverty in this country, having the equivalent of a modern supercomputer in their pocket. And what we need to ask is, how can we use that in a powerful way? And certainly social media is one direction to take that. Another spin that you can put on this is to talk about new literacies. Now, saying that there are new literacies is a very strong claim, because literacy means something that's fundamental, like reading and writing and mathematics. So do we really have fundamental new literacies in the 21st century? Well, we certainly see them in operation all around us. I do distributed cognition, for example, when I do my income taxes, because I use a tax preparation program in a kind of intellectual partnership. The program does two things I don't do well, which is to manipulate numbers accurately and put them on the right line of the IRS form. And I do a kind of thinking the program doesn't do well, which is to make up creative excuses for the IRS. So the two of us have a distributed cognition that's really quite effective. And when we look around us in the 21st century with these very powerful devices, we increasingly see this going on. One of my daughters is only 13. We adopted her from India. So she's still coming home and doing homework. And as I watch her, I'm struck by the fact that she is doing transmedia navigation, because she goes to the textbook and the encyclopedia, but she also goes to Wikipedia and various websites. And then she has to use judgment, she and her friends that are instant messaging with her about the homework, because they're getting information that's contradictory, incomplete, inconsistent, sometimes biased. And they have to figure out what to believe, which of course is one of the skills that people discuss in that Education for Life and Work report as fundamental for the 21st century. Now, I don't believe in all the new literacies. After decades of faculty meetings, I no longer believe in collective intelligence, for example. But it may be that these technologies are powerful enough that even that goal can be attained. So the point is, there's a lot that we can do with communities. We do not see this in massive experiences now, and we often do not see this in online experiences now, but the potential is certainly there. Digitally simulated experiences are probably less familiar to you, but I work in emerging technologies, which of course change over time, but for the last 2 decades, I've been studying the power of immersion for learning. And immersion means that you are psychologically located somewhere else from where your body is. So we've all experienced this. You go to the movies, maybe you watch The Hobbit, and after about 5 minutes, you're no longer aware that you're sitting in a movie theater surrounded by strangers. Psychologically, you're with Gandalf and Bilbo somewhere in Middle-earth. Now, that's due to a very big visual field and high-fidelity sound, strong acting, a compelling plot. But it's actually a weak form of immersion because it's passive. You're just watching. And what I and my colleagues have studied and designed is much more powerful immersive environments because they're active, because you actually are shaping the environment, not just watching it. And I'm just going to show you some examples of the first and third type of immersion because this bears on the issue of situated learning. If I have a massive learning experience and I'm not going to be able to send people out for field experiences or for internships or residencies in the real world, can I simulate some part of that in a massive, scalable way that's still going to be powerful? So as an example of a virtual world, the most recent one our team has built is called Ecomove. This is a science curriculum for the middle school in which there are 2 digital ecosystems, pond and forest. So even if you're in the middle of New York City in the middle of the winter, you can be immersed in a pond in the summer and play the role of an ecosystem scientist. And to give just a feeling of what that might be like, I'm going to show you part of this video to give you a sense of the kinds of affordances for learning that we can build into this situation.
Ecomove is an exciting new curriculum research project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education that uses immersive virtual environments to teach middle school students about ecosystems and causal patterns. It includes 2 computer-based modules, Pond and Forest, within a 4-week inquiry-based ecosystems curriculum. Here we are in the pond module. We can walk around the pond and see all the different plants and animals, like these ducks. The camera tool lets us take pictures, and saving the photo displays a virtual field guide with information about each of the organisms we find. We can also walk under the water to see the species living there. And using a virtual microsubmarine, we can shrink down and see the microscopic life in the pond at different levels of magnification.
This gives students a profound respect for why you don't drink pond water.
The environment around the pond includes features like a golf course, roads, and houses. Following this runoff pipe leads us to a drainage ditch near a new housing development, where we meet a landscaper putting down fertilizer. Throughout the environment, on different days, we meet virtual characters like Manny, who may provide useful information. Back at the pond, the water measurement tools let us take various measurements of the water in the pond, such as phosphates and turbidity. Students can collect weather and population data as well. The calendar tool lets us travel through time in order to see how the pond has changed on different days. Here, it's raining. When we walk under the water, we can see how cloudy the water is. The turbidity is higher. And we can also take another measurement. The data view lets us see and compare data we've collected. The atom tracker tool lets us see what happens to atoms in the ecosystem over time. We can find and track 3 atoms: carbon, phosphorus, and oxygen. On each simulated day, we can find the atom tracker signs and read a description of what has happened to each atom since our last visit. Here we see an oxygen atom that is part of a water molecule in the leaf of a tree. And then on our next visit, we see that through photosynthesis, the oxygen atom is being released into the air as part of an O2 molecule. As students explore different days at the pond, they discover that on July 28th, all the large fish in the pond are dead. Through the inquiry-based curriculum, students work in teams to collect and analyze data in order to figure out what killed the fish. Once the students have collected all the data, they can use the graphing tool to compare different variables to help them create concept maps that explain why the fish died.
All right, so there's more, but you can certainly find this on the internet. The point is, that's developed for middle school students, but there's no reason why we couldn't have developed it for graduate school majors in ecosystem science. It's just a matter of putting in the kinds of resources that would be required. The game industry has taught us how to scale stuff like this. Given enough servers, we could have 1 million people in the Ecomove at the same time, and it would be dirt cheap as a learning experience if you amortize the costs over even 10,000 people, let alone over 1 million people. So this is a kind of situated learning that we've been studying to try to understand its strengths and limits as a way not of replacing the real world, but complementing the real world. And when you have a massive learning experience, finding a way to do situated learning that isn't limited by the real world. The video mentioned that students work in teams. This is another way of building community and getting back into the social media dimensions of what's going on. But I would go to meetings of ecosystem scientists and show them Ecomove, and they'd get mad. They'd be angry in the first 10 minutes or so. And I was taken aback because I think it's nice. And so I said, well, why are you mad? And they said, Chris, our motto is no child left indoors. And now you're building a bunch of stuff so kids never have to go outside again. And I said, no, 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 that's not the point. The point is, when they do go outside, to lure them out there and to have them see the world through the eyes of an ecosystem scientist. So I'm very glad that now we're using a different kind of immersion, augmented reality, to complement the Ecomove and to do what the ecosystem scientists want, get kids right into the middle of ecosystems. So if Alice in Wonderland is the metaphor for the virtual world, where you become a digital person through the monitor taking you into Wonderland, the Terminator, for those of you who remember that movie with the robot, is the model for augmented reality, because the Terminator has magic eyes and sees an overlay over the real world of different kinds of knowledge and simulations and visualizations that empower taking action, making decisions, learning things. So I want to show you again a brief research video, or part of a brief research video, that illustrates what we're doing with Ecomobile as a different kind of immersion for situated learning that could complement massive learning.
Ecomobile is a program we've been developing for middle school students that helps them to connect with their learning in the classroom with the real world experience. So they've been able to work in the classroom in their science class with a multi-user virtual environment where they explore a virtual pond and they act like scientists to collect information about an ecological mystery that's happened at the virtual pond. But then now we've developed Ecomove to allow the students to take some of the pieces that they're learning about in the classroom and learn more about them in the real world. So we've developed an augmented reality game that the students can play on smartphones using a 3G wireless network at a real pond. So as the students move around the real environment, they encounter hotspots, and at the hotspots there is information that connects with what they were learning in the classroom. Things like what's a producer, a consumer, or a decomposer, or allows them to take measurements of the pond to test its water quality. So the students have been coming out with us to the pond environment and going on field trips and using augmented reality to connect their experiences with the classroom.
Wants to know what is the most common type of organism you observe. Honestly, we've observed a lot of producers.
Because we see a lot of green, and all of these plants and trees are producers.
They all produce stuff.
Yeah.
The kids have been very excited to use the smartphone devices, and it's amazing to see how quickly they can pick it up and use it to its full capacity. It took a very short introduction for the kids to be able to navigate with the device and to access these hotspots. And they were figuring things out and troubleshooting together. It was really fun to see them work together to solve some of the problems that they were encountering. And you know, one student might not quite understand how something worked, and another student was right there to help them figure it out. Some of the programs they're using and the probes that they're using are very similar to what real scientists use to monitor ecosystems. And so they're getting experiences that rival what real scientists do, and they realize that, and they see things about the water quality and start to understand what this means for, you know, we've had a lot of rain in the last few days. And they're connecting the fact that the rain might affect what's happening in the pond and what's happening in their local environment.
All right, so that's again background. There's material on the web, including more of this video that talks about it. The point is that we can now do a variety of kinds of situated learning. It's difficult to do good instructional design for augmented reality, but once you've got a good instructional design, it's pretty easy to author, in contrast to a virtual world. So we could imagine if you had a massive learning experience that had a global footprint, you could pick areas where there were enough students to construct some local augmented realities, and then over time you could expand that as you taught successive generations of the course. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, this is low cost, where's the money going to come from? Well, I think people are thinking about the economics of massive all wrong. I want to build a massive learning experience that lasts 6 weeks and it costs $5. Almost anybody in the world can come up with $5 for a 6-week experience if they think it's valuable enough for them. So let's say that there's, out of the 6 billion people in the world, there's 100 million people at any one time who are really interested in a 6-week learning experience. I think that's a pretty conservative assumption. And let's say that I come up with a learning experience that appeals to just 0.5% of those, just 500,000 people in a year, 500,000 people who are willing to pay $5. So every week I start another cohort of 10,000 through my 6-week experience, so that it's massive but not horrendously unmanageable. And that generates $2.5 million a year. You can do a lot with $2.5 million a year, especially if you're nonprofit, to build all sorts of interesting stuff and use it to create a model of learning that can reach those 21st century goals that we started with. So I'm excited about the work with augmented reality, particularly for developing countries, which are never going to have an educational system where there's a school every 3 miles and a university every 30 miles. They're going to have to leap straight over the industrial era to a 21st century system, and it's going to have things like augmented reality in it. In fact, AR contradicts something that we've been saying as educators for people for millennia. For millennia, we've been saying to people, you want to know about the world? You got to get away from the world. The world is noisy. The world is chaotic. The world is confusing. Come to the forum with Socrates. Come to the medieval campus at Harvard. Come to the industrial era classroom, and away from the world, we'll sort out the world. And that's true. That is true. But now we can say, but when you're in the world, you're going to have a device with you that knows who you are and how you like to learn, where you are and what around you has been augmented for learning, and who you like to learn with and how to reach them. That's a very interesting vision. But I've talked about community. I've talked about situated learning in a little different way than we ordinarily think about it. But what about this issue of instructional support? After all, people don't figure out things just by having experiences. People figure out things by having guidance. Well, there's something very interesting about both social media and virtual worlds and augmented realities and tutoring systems and a lot of other things that we use. And that is that they generate log files because you're interacting with something on a server, and the server automatically records what you're doing and timestamps it. So we have an excellent idea in things like the Ecomove of exactly what each learner is doing second by second. And we've done a variety of research exploring what that might mean, not for summative evaluation so much, which is interesting, but not the most important usage, certifying at the end what students do and don't know as ecosystem scientists, but as formative evaluation, as diagnostic evaluation. This is what you did yesterday. Here's where it fell short. Now you know that, and I know that too, and I can change my instruction. Is this easy? No, it's hellishly difficult, because we have intellectually indigestible amounts of information. And so we have to aggregate, we have to filter, we have to cluster, we have to have smart people sort out what patterns are there, and then how we can automate the scoring of those patterns so that you can, in a massive learning experience, provide automated feedback. Was writing an NSF proposal about that on the train coming down when I was sitting on the track stationary for an hour and a half. But what kind of feedback could we provide? Well, we could provide not very smart feedback, but people are pretty smart. So in an earlier virtual world called River City, we would give students in near real time information about what they had done and what their team had done in terms of exploring the world. And that turned out to be very powerful. And if the teacher helped them to interpret this, and that is more instructional presence, it became more powerful still. People build guidance systems into games and virtual worlds, and it's diagnostic to look at how somebody interacts with a guidance system. Do they use it at all? How deep do they go? It tells you what they know and don't know. Animated pedagogical agents. I had a doctoral student who did work with NASA, where NASA scientists would adopt an elementary school classroom and they would mentor kids on STEM learning. And it was terrific, except for the fact that you can't scale it because you run out of NASA scientists pretty quickly. So I challenged her to come up with something that was scalable, and we came up with Dr. C, who is an animated pedagogical agent. There's no AI here. This is really sort of a dumb back end in terms of pretty simple word pattern matching. But what her doctoral thesis showed is that while Dr. C was inferior to a NASA scientist who was motivated and who knew how to talk to kids, it was superior to NASA scientists who either weren't motivated or who didn't know how to talk to kids. And it was scalable. So there's a lot of stuff we can do at the low end, summative kinds of virtual performance assessments. And so what people are starting to ask now is, not only can I use something like Ecomove to determine what people do and don't know about science inquiry, but if I have enough of these experiences in my 6-week course or my 12-week massive course, can I say something about collaboration? Can I say something about leadership and metacognition and self-efficacy? Now I'm getting into the intrapersonal and interpersonal dimensions that we've got to have a way of assessing without necessarily having instructional presence, which drives the price up. So here's the claim. And this is a claim that I'm making more strongly than the report, but the report makes it as well. And that is to say that if we put together everything that I've talked about, you've got your virtual study groups with complementary expertise, you've got social media, you've got different kinds of communication channels that build community, you've got virtual worlds and augmented realities for situated learning, you've got different kinds of log file-based performance assessments. If we knew how to do all of that, would that be like the face-to-face or the blended experience at Harvard or Columbia? Nah, probably not. Probably not that quality. Would it be better than 90% of what passes for higher education now? Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the promise. Not to take that 90% of higher education and make it massive so that you've got a much more efficient way of doing the wrong thing, but to come up with a different model. That's why the report is about new technology-based models. So there's a lot of other stuff in the report that I don't have time to go into because I want to have some interaction with you. But of course, if we knew how to do all the stuff on this side, we would have to rethink a lot of educational processes, which is not an easy thing to do. In fact, it's a very difficult thing to do. Someone once said that it's harder to move a cemetery than to change a campus, even though the two involve similar skills. And we find ourselves, you know, wrestling with how to make even minor changes in educational process. But the report describes organizational strategies that could help us to do that, and the kinds of professional development that might be valuable in accomplishing that. Personally, I think the hardest part about all this is not learning how to do it, but unlearning how to do what we do. After all those years of being a student in an industrial era schooling system and all those years teaching with presentational assimilative models, very difficult for me to keep unlearning that and being creative and relearning new ways of thinking about teaching and learning. But again, I think these community-based situated experiences can find ways for us to do that. So I hope that I've lured you into thinking more about the report. I hope I've lured you into thinking about Massive in a different way than MOOCs. And thank you for listening to all this.
Okay.
Do we have a little time?
Yeah, we have a couple minutes for some questions from the audience. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your great talk. It was very inspiring. I'd like to ask you about that macro point of view. I was reading an article from the Dede, and he was saying that MOOCs will replace like university organizations and university organizations, like high-level universities are going to remain, but the low, weak universities are going to be replaced by MOOCs. But I don't think it's that simple. And like as you said, but I personally think that it's going to be more like a transformative. Like those universities are going to transform their form, or either new organizations are going to come up in those areas to provide as you said, the new technology model. But like I'd like to ask you which direction, like from the macro point of view, the organizational structure is going to be.
Well, I hope you're not embarrassed by this, but I want to introduce Fiona Holland, who's actually interviewed 75 approximately people working with different kinds of massive learning experiences, and has looked at things like XMOOCs, CMOOCs, wrappers where you use a MOOC as one part of a course, but you also have other more traditional parts of a course. And I think that what we're going to end up seeing is some kind of a very rich blend of these different sorts of things. The one thing that we can be certain of is that we're not going to have things that have a 4% retention rate and a 1% completion rate as something that replaces higher education as it is now. That's just garbage. So we've got to get past the hype to really ask seriously what are the aspects of teaching and learning that can be made powerful at massive scale? And we do know a lot that suggests that that could be powerful, but it's not going to be by scaling up the traditional model. Yeah, Fiona, since I...
Yeah. Not to put me on the spot, but on a completely different topic. Are there any examples of where technology has been used to improve what you call the intrapersonal skills as opposed to the interpersonal skills?
There are not a lot of examples of improving the intrapersonal skills, but Val Shute at Florida State University has done some very interesting Gates-funded work with creating games that increase tenacity. And of course, there's a lot of research growing on academic tenacity and how important that is, that it isn't just making everything engaging, because there are parts of things that are tough to learn that are not engaging, where you've got to be persistent and tenacious if you want to get through it. And I think that that kind of work, as people recognize how important this is going to be pioneered. I actually think the military does some clever things along these lines, and that's another interesting place to look for some of the kinds of intrapersonal skill development, because they take people who barely made it out of high school, and in 6 weeks they have to train them to handle a $100 million weapons system. So they've obviously got to think a lot about work ethic and self-regulation and so on if they're going to succeed in that effort. Yes?
Yeah, I just wondered if you, I'm sure you've thought about this, but there's a tradition in universities probably going back to Torino, and that there's a distinction between the community of scholars and the community at large. Mm-hmm. I wonder, given the Snowden revelations, then when you collect so much data about individual, I mean, I guess I could imagine somebody taking a political science course on the Middle East in a MOOC format, and I think you would be pretty silly to say anything very, it's like speaking in public, so anything you spoke in public, maybe you could say. I know I'm taking a MOOC now with some of my colleagues, and I'm getting emails now that are spam mails, because one of our 20,000 colleagues has been harvesting data from the MOOC. And so my question, it seems that the assumption or the observation is that if you collect data about people, you're going to be forced to give it up. I mean, that's basically what it comes to. If you want a private web search, then you have to go to DuckDuckGo, where they don't collect data. So when somebody comes to them and says, give us all your data, say, well, we'll give you everything we have. And they just don't collect it. So my question just is when you're using data mining techniques to really improve education, is there a dark side to that? And how should we as scholars, as a community of scholars, how can we address that?
Well, first, you make very good points, and there absolutely is a dark side to all the data that's now being collected about us. Actually, education is one of the least worrisome areas because it's every single aspect of our lives. There is no such thing as privacy anymore. And you're right that data can never easily be considered to be secure. There are some interesting approaches, though, for trying to think about that differently. One of the approaches is to say that you never let go of your data. Your data is not uploaded into the cloud where people can get it. It lives on your device and it never goes off your device. And if somebody wants to sell you a service, you download their processing algorithm and run it on your device rather than giving them your data and running it there, where you've lost control of your data. In other words, technically, from a technical perspective, we can be private or non-private. It's the economic drivers and the political drivers that are creating this situation in which we lose control of our data. So it's a big issue, bigger than obviously the kinds of educational things that I'm talking about. And I do think that what we need to do is to create the kind of learning experiences where people are not too worried about the sort of information that goes up onto the server. But for some subjects, as you point out, it's going to be an issue.
Okay. We have to get Professor Dede up to a meeting at 4 o'clock, so maybe can I take one more question and then we'll get him. Okay, I have two of you. We'll try to get two of you. If you have a quick question, you can make it very quick.
Yeah. You talked about how difficult it is to do good instructional design in these environments. Just wondered if you've got any thoughts about emerging new ways to approach that.
Well, I think a lot of it is trying things and watching them break. So I and my colleagues use design-based research, which a lot of other people do. And to just give a quick example, one of the things about augmented reality is you have to be very careful that your interaction with the device doesn't overwhelm your interaction with the real world, because then you're accomplishing the opposite of what you set out to do. One of my former postdocs has this wonderful slide for an augmented reality he built at the zoo, which is a great environment when you think about how you could augment a zoo so people could look at animals and could gain a lot of information about them. But in this particular slide, a group of kids are sitting on the ground looking at their cell phones with a condor sitting in the middle of them, and they're looking at their cell phones instead of at the bird. So that's an example of the kinds of instructional design puzzles that it's taking us a while to sort through. So you have the final
Well, I'm not sure this may be too long a question, but I'm wondering with regard to the interpersonal, if you can share any insights about how you can work with learners to really develop effective peer assessment, because in the large environment it seems that peer assessment is going to be critical.
Right. I think that peer assessment is a tough one. I wish I had a better answer to the question than what I'm about to give. I think that one of the things that we could do in creating these idealized learning groups would be to have people who have a lot of experience and people who have less experience, but who have something to bring to the table that's different in the same group. And then the more experienced peers, at least, may be better at assessment, especially with a little mentoring, than the less experienced peers. But there are clear limits to peer-based assessment because it is a way of reinforcing misconceptions. And so my colleagues and I are studying these automated systems that have built-in models of expert performance. Again, that's subject sensitive as to whether or not you can do that. So I don't have a great answer to that. I think it is a very interesting challenge that we're facing.
Okay. Well, let's give a round of applause for Professor Dede. And thank you very much for coming, and hopefully we'll see you in January 31st for the next session.